If you're trying to grind a rank 30 or even hit mastery, then you'll need to know which hypercharges are bad and which ones are broken. Starting off, the 10th worst hypercharge is M's. Now don't get me wrong, this really isn't a bad hypercharge. The knockback and increased speed can really help secure kills. Just be sure to use this on multiple enemies. But the only problem is that it can take quite a bit of time to charge up. But hey, maybe the knockback can be used when you actually run out of gadgets. Tara's super already had huge potential, but her hypercharge has made it even better. Honestly, the only people that could possibly miss this hyper are my ranked randoms. I don't think this is enough to make her meta, but she's certainly a lot stronger now, especially in the brawlers that don't pierce. Shelly likely has the most basic hypercharge in the game. It makes her super a bit more powerful, with no extra abilities like going through walls and dropping popcorn. Just like M's, this hyper isn't even that bad, and it's incredibly easy to chain if you wind up on higher HP enemies. But in terms of countering tanks, there's just simply better options in this meta, which we'll cover later. Max's hypercharge is one that actually takes a bit of knowledge to fully utilize. Most players use it at the first given chance since you can give it to your teammates from far away. But since this hypercharge gives you part of your super back, the best way to use it is by having your whole team group up to stack the supercharges. Being able to cycle back an important super can be game changing, and this is what makes Max's hypercharge very strong. And not to mention that the extra speed can turn you into a Walmart Tensai. Being able to have two supers sounds good on paper, but Squeak's hypercharge makes it decent at best. I do think Squeak's hyper had big potential, but it takes him about 12 shots to get, which takes surprisingly long. Not to mention the fact that his super doesn't have any additional effects like most hypers are known for. But hey, unless you can do that trick to hit the save twice, I wouldn't spend my coins on this. Sandy has a hypercharge that almost always guarantees you can hold control. His Sandstorm was already so strong in moving up the map, but the added speed and very small mutant enemies, you can easily sneak up and even cycle your super back, but be sure to practice the best place to use it on. El Primo's hypercharge sounded really strong on its initial release, but its effect is kind of unnecessary. To utilize its effect, you have to land on an opponent, and at that point, why need the extra pull-in effect? Not to mention that its hyper takes quite a bit of time to charge up, putting it on the much weaker side of hypercharges. Do you remember Rico's broken mutation? Well, it's back. Kind of. His hypercharge can quickly turn the game into an Undertale boss fight with its insane distance across the map. But like I said with Sandy, placement is key. So be sure to look for the best possible angles to ensure you cover as much of the map as possible. Jean's hypercharge is the definition of feeling unstoppable but quickly being humbled. Having three hands really isn't that strong because of how separated they are. I mean, every time I use this hypercharge, I really only focus on what my main hand is going to grab, because trying to hit all three at once is just unnecessary and often useless. Even after his nerf, Gale is still a top pick, and his hyper further proves that. It's relatively easy to charge up, and it's arguably one of the easiest hypercharges to chain in the game. There really isn't much else to say about the old man, but hey, even at his age, he's a force to be reckoned with. Nani received a hypercharge this update, with a neat idea of making her super easier to hit, but this means it's now harder to steer around walls, along with it not even doing any additional damage other than the base stat buffs of using a hyper. Alongside that, it takes forever to charge. This was like my 6th attempt at trying to get it in a real game. It just takes way too long. Instead of nerfing Poco, they buffed him with a brand new hypercharge. Having a super that heals and grants a temporary shield is something that will synergize very well with the tanks and assassins that are looking to be meta this season. Definitely a hyper that's worth investing in. Charlie has really struggled within the last few months to find a spot in the meta. Her hypercharge is simply spawning spiders when it lands. This reminds me of what I said earlier about M's hyper, where it's really only useful when you run out of gadgets. And that's really the only value that it brings. So realistically, you're only going to use this for the extra speed and damage. Barley feels so unstoppable when it gets his hypercharge. The range that it provides is deceptively large, as well as the extreme damage that it does. With correct placement, you can cover an entire important area, like a hot zone, high safe, or even an enemy spawn, and still have plenty of extra area to cover any enemies desperately trying to escape. Miko's super design philosophy really prohibits the full use of his hypercharge. Going into the air after immediately using your hyper wastes the additional stat buffs that you get. The only real optimal way to play is to use your hyper and then super right when it's about to run out. But a convoluted strategy as well as a super long hypercharge rate makes this a bad hypercharge overall. Once an F tier and now a top pick, Frank's rework made him insanely strong alongside his hypercharge. He gets it very fast, especially with his passive tank trait, and while it is possible to dodge, Frank's massive amount of health makes him an absolute must-pick for playing aggressive. Just be sure to line up your hyper close to your enemies. As a Sprout main, I'm more or less disappointed on how they made his Hypercharge. Having a small, and I mean small, area of damage effect around his super is such an unnecessary effect. I mean, why couldn't it have been something to help support him? Like give him an area of healing or an area of increased damage? But hey, at least you can do a cheese strategy to deal a fair amount of damage with the safe. If only Sprout was actually good in Heist. Surge has been slowly creeping his way up the meta, and his Hypercharge was exactly what he needed. His Hyper deals an insane amount of damage when it lands. The area that it covers is just so hard to dodge. 10 hits to charge a Hyper sounds like a lot, but Surge is known for comboing with his super and reload gadget, so you should be getting his Hyper anywhere from 1 to 3 times a game. Another cool trick is that you can use his Hyper while at max level, and you don't even have to use his super. The worst Hypercharge in the game is Pearls. There's so many problems with this Hyper. To start off, the effect is useless. She creates an area of fire that's smaller than Chester's slow super. Next, it takes forever to charge. And keep in mind, you're only going to be using this for the extra stat buffs. But the worst part of it is that she loses all of her heat after supering, so she'll do no damage. Oh, but Mythic you say, just use the star power that loses less heat when supering. Well yeah, using that star power will ensure that you never get out of diamond. This Hypercharge is by far the worst and will never be good. And now, the best Hypercharge in the game goes to Mortis. Honestly, it was about time that we saw the creature of the night become relevant again. And man, is his Hyper strong. Chaining supers with combined damage and passive healing on enemies hit, you become a killing machine with Mortis. And it's honestly a pretty easy Hyper to charge up, with it only taking about 10 hits. And hey, that seems like a lot, but just like Surge, you can do easy combos to build up your Hyper very fast. You'll be getting this so many times per game, and as long as you line it up with 2 to 3 enemies, you can guarantee a team wipe. And who could forget the real best Hypercharge, the subscribe button.